I am being watched. Welcome everyone to the Person of Interest Season 1 Episode 12 review. It's called Legacy, so spoilers for the episode as always. This one is about the protection of a lawyer who is helping prisoners who have been mistreated, particularly in this case a prisoner who has went back to prison after violating parole, but there's some shady suspicions about, the validity of if he did violate the parole, and it all ends up being about this corrupt parole officer who's part of this huge scheme, this huge basically fraud scheme of getting tons of money for a bunch of foster kids who don't actually exist and profiting from it. The parole officer's in on it. There's someone who works at the government who works on it, who's in on it. There's foster parents who are in on the whole scheme. Basically, they keep targeting prisoners who have a kid but no spouse. So they all have single parent prisoners whose kids go out of the foster system, and then they make up extra kids on the paperwork that don't actually exist to make a bunch of money. So that's what it ends up all being about, and I'm just getting that out of the way first because I don't know how to even tease that out over the course of a discussion. I'm just going to get that out of the way, and then we could talk about the all the other stuff, the important character stuff, how it handles specific sequences. Reese protecting this young lawyer, it's pretty typical stuff, but there was one moment early on that did catch me with a smile on my face, and it's a very Batman moment actually. But she's about to be killed by someone walking up behind her, but she's wearing earphones, so she's not hearing anything. She's just walking down the street, bopping along to her music as she pleases, and this guy's about to kill her from behind, and Reese just kind of swoops in and tackles him out of the frame with her never noticing that anything was going on behind her. So it was a very Batman thing. It was, the victim was never even aware they were in danger. And then Reese, fights this guy and actually loses and references the fact that he's still recovering from gunshots. So they've not forgotten about that. It doesn't really come into play that much. It is just this one moment where he kind of loses a fight and says that he's in pain, and that's pretty much it. But I appreciate that I'm bringing it up and just not forgetting that continuity is there. So I appreciate that. But yeah, I mean, most of the main plot is solid enough. I think it suffers from one of the things that the last episode suffered from, is that a sort of surprise villain towards the end does feel very undercooked. The guy who was friendly with the lawyer who works at the government, he turns out to be part of the scheme, and that's fine enough, I suppose, but it pulls out a gun within seconds after he kind of reveals that he's a bad guy and tries to kill the lawyer, and it kind of felt a little bit like we didn't set him up enough in a way that felt like he was a killer. When they revealed that he was the contact at the government who was forging all this paperwork, I kind of never got the sense that he was this criminal mastermind who was willing to kill people. It felt more like he was just someone who was happy to do a bit of fraud and make some money. So that was a little bit of an escalation. There was a bit of a jumping to 11 for him as a character in the moment. It's not a big deal because he's honestly, he's only in one scene before the reveal that he is a bad guy, because we have other things to focus on this episode. Much like last episode, there's a lot going on. We don't have flashbacks, although we do have a subplot with Finch that kind of ties into flashbacks, so I'll get to that in a second. But there's a fun little chase sequence towards the end of the main plot with Reese coming after this guy when he's chasing the lawyer through. It's basically the failing basement of a library kind of thing, where they're running. If you imagine the opening scenes from Ghostbusters, where it's all these really close together, just shelves and shelves of books. It's kind of like that, but with failing cabinets. And they're just kind of running down these aisles, and she's pulling out the drawers to try and slow them down. And it's effective. It's all good and well. Reese's interaction with the person of interest. I'm sick of saying the lawyer. Her name is Andrea. He kind of goes to her early on and claims to be an ex-con himself, and that he thinks he's been wronged by his current employer, and it's all just a ruse, of course, to get close to her, to clone her phone and plant some bugs and things like that. But as the episode goes on, he ultimately has to come in and save her when she's at the library, which is a very not as impressive by any means, but it did make me think of a scene in John Wick 3, because there's a very prominent fight that takes place in a library early on in that movie. But he sort of has to reveal himself, as he sometimes does, as a protector, and has to explain to her she's in danger. It doesn't go too heavy on the, her going, "Who are you? Like why are you protecting me?" It kind of shies away from that in this episode a bit. It just kind of rolls with the punches a little. And maybe that's just a conscious choice, because it would get very repetitive if every person he ends up swooping in to save all really goes heavy into that line of thinking. So even though technically maybe she should be, I think the audience at this point have heard those questions enough that we're happy for it to be a little shorthanded, even if realistically she still would be asking the questions. It just makes sense from a writing perspective, and knowing what your audience has already witnessed a lot of, assuming they've been watching all the episodes, which I think any loyal viewer, and the loyal viewers should be the ones who are rewarded the most, always. It's nice if your show can work for people who just dip in and out, but the ones who actually commit to it should be the ones who are given the first thought and the first rewards. So yeah, the main plot's fine enough. It's someone who's trying to do good again. We have this very noble character who's trying to help basically people who are ex-criminals, but society is kind of like kicking them when they're down, and she believes people are owed second chances. And Reese repeatedly this episode says that he also believes in second chances, and that's kind of he's getting his second chance by working with Finch. So thematically it all works, all clicks in place. It doesn't feel as special as some of the previous episodes where we've sort of tied the themes into like Reese's character with the main plot. I think partly just because it does feel like we're treading on similar ground here a little bit, which is not to say that the episode doesn't keep itself feeling fresh, but it keeps itself fresh with a lot of other things. Like, it's the fact that Carter's actively helping him and is involved in the plot that makes it feel fresh. The actual case itself, it's a little bit of a mix of, like, we had a noble judge before, so now we get a noble lawyer. That's not a million miles apart. The fact that she's been taken out because she's going to expose this corruption potentially, and powerful, dangerous people want to keep her quiet. We've had stories like that before. So the interest from this episode comes from everything else, and the big one is Carter. In fact, the episode opens with Carter sitting in like a diner or a cafe waiting for someone, and she's looking around all kind of nervous, and then eventually it's Reese who shows up. And it makes sense, because last episode, Finch gave her an introduction into their world and what they do. She's more aware of it, and Reese comes to see her, and she's got questions. He doesn't tell her about the machine, and Finch later specifically says she can never know about the machine. I've got a funny feeling she's going to at some point, because you're not getting what you want in this case, Finch. But for now, she doesn't know where the information's coming from. But this is how we learn about her current case for the episode. Reese gives her the name, says, "I need to know more about her backstory, look at her record, all that kind of thing." And, so she becomes this active participant. He gives her a phone. She calls him a couple times throughout the episode. And some of the real fun that comes from this is that when she calls Reese for the first time, Fusco is watching her like take this phone call, and she goes off in like another part of the station so that she can't be heard, and he thinks that's suspicious. So while Reese is on the phone to Carter, Fusco calls Reese and warns them that Carter's up to something and she's talking to someone all suspicious like, and Reese just sort of smiles and tells him that it doesn't matter. It's fine, it's all fine, Fusco, I've got everything under control. And that's something that kind of comes up again next time Fusco's brought in. But I really enjoyed playing with that a little bit. The fact that Fusco does not know that Carter is now communicating with Reese and Finch, and vice versa. Carter doesn't know that Fusco's worked with them already. So they're having a little bit of fun with that. I'm not sure how long that'll last. I suspect that'll be a short-lived bit of entertainment before everyone's kind of aware of everyone else's involvement. But I think that's smart, because it lets us enjoy almost the comedy of them not knowing about each other, until we get to be excited again when the cards are on the table and we can have another rush of dopamine as characters become more aware of who each other are. Because that's something that's been very fun in this show, is every time we've nudged forward those relationships, I think I've had a really good time with that. So yeah, so Carter's involved. Carter keeps making jabs at Reese throughout the episode. She gives him an address where a suspect might be, and she asks, "Hey, can you not turn this into a crime scene?" And when Reese fights the guy and chases him, he gets hit by a truck, so it turns into a crime scene, which was unexpected, by the way. I did not predict that scene ending with the guy just like running into the road and getting hit by a vehicle. So the dark comedy in me, gave me a chuckle out of that. But and likewise, she keeps saying little jabs like, "Oh, how about try not to break any more laws today?" Things like that. And then she'll call Reese and he'll have information because he broke into a guy's place and stole his computer, and she gets frustrated by that. But what's interesting is that by the end of the episode, it once again reveals the potential of them working together, because last episode she was able to save someone and arrest a bad guy with the information that Finch gave her. This episode, this main story ends with Carter being able to arrest this guy who was trying to kill Andrea. She shows up and arrests him, and there's a little nod between her and Reese, and it's kind of like now, and that's not to say that he's ended up killing everyone who's been a perpetrator in the previous episodes, but a lot of them have ended in some kind of death, or if they do get arrested, he has to kind of like, he had to really go out of his way to sort of gift wrap and arrange for them to be caught with setting them up or leaving evidence or whatever it may have been. At the end of this episode, Carter's able to take him in relatively by the book. Yes, obviously some of the steps to get there are dodgy from a legal perspective, but fundamentally this man pulled a gun on Andrea and took shots at her, and the victim survived and witnessed it. He was still holding this gun when she showed up on duty as a police officer. There's enough there that this is a rightful arrest, even if everything else, the information that led us to this point is a little bit sketchy. So I think she's already seen a result from working with them. And likewise, maybe Reese and Finch appreciate that they've got a detective who can just and obviously they had Fusco, but they've got someone now who someone who cares in a different way. So someone who actually wants to clean up the streets, as it were. So I think the benefit of this relationship is already sort of bore some fruit by the end, and I think Carter recognizes that. So despite all the little things that Reese does throughout the episode that she's not okay with, ultimately the end goal works out. And it's not just that they saved this woman's life, they exposed an entire corruption scheme that was embezzling money. And even more important than that, perhaps, are these innocent people who are being put back in prison, even though they're actually cleaning up their act, even though they have played by the rules and they are doing what they're supposed to be doing, and they're supposed to be having their second chance, and it's been taken away from them by these corrupt people, particularly the parole officer, but in lieu of all these other people involved. So I think all that stuff worked out really well, and I think it's Carter's involvement in the plot, and maybe that's by design that they went with a plot that's kind of similar to like a couple of different things we've had already and kind of mashed it up a little bit. Maybe the reason why we went in that route is because the fun here is seeing how Carter gets involved and integrates into a typical episode. So by design, it's a typical person of interest story to see how she affects it by being involved. That said, though, thematically, it does, work that the victims of this crime, by and large, I mean, I suppose the children are as well, but the father, in this case, who she's trying to help get out of prison, who's been wrongfully put back in, and these other examples, these are people who are being wronged, who do have mistakes in their past, who do deserve a second chance, and that fits into of course the redemption idea of Reese, and potentially one day Fusco, and potentially other characters. So I appreciate that. So yeah, the other stuff here, I'll just mention Fusco briefly because after a little bit of setup, Reese gives him a job. Reese was also following Finch earlier on, taking some photos, trying to get into his computer, as he does. And the little reveal at the end of the episode is that the mission that he sent Fusco on is to tail Finch. And it's kind of an exciting ending. It's like, okay, despite all the trust that is maybe built up, he still needs to know more about Finch. And maybe we'll get more insight into exactly why he feels that he needs to know more about Finch in the future. And we'll get more sort of the fallout of this, of course. But at least in the moment, this was like, no, he's taking steps to actually try and figure things out. He's done enough, as much as he can, by just snooping around. But now he's actually sent someone on a mission. And maybe that's the other benefit of having a new detective they can rely on, is he can send the other one on the secret mission that Finch doesn't know about. So we'll see what comes from that. It's exciting, but not too much to say as of yet. But the other big thing, of course, is Finch himself and the subplot of this episode, which is him and the son of Ingram. So Will Ingram is introduced this episode. Finch goes and bails him out of jail for something minor, presumably. And basically, we find out that the son doesn't really know a whole lot about his dad's company and that the machine exists. Finch obviously comes here as kind of the uncle to bail him out, and they clearly have a close relationship. But he doesn't know that Finch, what he really did. Or, in fact, at one point he says something about Finch not knowing anything about computers, which is obviously the furthest possible thing from the truth. And that he is looking into who his dad was, and he's got all these old boxes of evidence out that were sort of returned after investigations from his dad's death. And he's looking at, he's questioning things like why the company went dark for like 7 years. And we, know enough to assume that that's the period where they were building the machine and there was no employees because it was all super secret. But now the son's looking into this. So we'll see, Finch does look a little bit concerned. He lies about it when he's talking to him. But, this does further reestablish that there was an emotional connection between Finch and Ingram, or there was a connection. And him looking out for Ingram's son maybe plays still into his guilt a little bit, of course, that he has over Ingram's death. But it's interesting that he does spend a lot of this episode in the subplot trying to convince Will to get back into practicing medicine. It turns out he's got a medical degree and he's worked as a doctor in the past, but he doesn't feel super passionate about doing that. And Finch is trying to encourage that in him, which I guess ties into Finch generally trying to encourage people to be the best they can. Again, maybe out of his own guilt for the things that he's ultimately ended up being a part of. But I think this was an interesting wrinkle to introduce something into Finch's personal life, which, other than the flashbacks, which were still all very much focused on the creation of the machine, we don't really have any. He comes across as kind of a loner, right? In fact, there's even a fun scene in here where when Reese is talking to Andrea, the lawyer, when he's pretending to be a potential new client, after he's planted the bug, he's sort of given the story about working for this boss that he's that's an unhealthy relationship. That's why he's quote unquote there to see a lawyer. And he starts describing this fake boss, but he's actually just describing Finch. He's describing how he's secretive and how he's a loner and how he's eccentric. And I appreciated Michael Emerson's performance here, where he kind of smiles a little bit when he's hearing this. Like, he's not offended that Reese is saying this. He sees the humor in Reese making these jabs while he knows he can hear him. I appreciate that. I think that's a fun little character bit, that despite the fact that this episode, and maybe this even adds to the end of the episode, where you feel like in some ways they're closer because he's making these little jokes, but then at the end of the episode he's went to the extreme lengths of having Finch tailed. So that maybe, that's almost maybe more surprising, that they're trying to lull you into this sense of friendship, so the ending feels like a bigger deal and a bigger surprise. Maybe it's a small thing, but that might be a little bit there as well as an intentional part in the writing. So Yeah, and also Carter's not very happy with the fact that Finch could hear her interrogation scene with the foster parents. She was none too pleased about that. But we know they've got everything bugged. We've been seeing this since the start of the show. It all makes a reasonable sense. So yeah, it's an enjoyable episode. It feels like an important character progression episode for a lot of the relationships. And the biggest thing that came out of it, I think, really is just seeing what it's like for Carter to work with the others. But I think, like I said earlier, by design, it's basically a very typical episode of Person of Interest. And now that we're 12 episodes in, we kind of have a... This is maybe even the first episode that feels like a typical episode. And that now we have enough of a baseline. We've had 11 episodes prior, and they've all felt kind of different enough. This is the first one that kind of feels like a mishmash of just the previous, like, sort of general idea of the show. But like I say, I do think that's almost intentional, because the whole point is to have a normal story that we're used to in this show, but with the inclusion of the new variable. And that new variable is a Detective Carter who's in on the job and who is actively helping. And it's notable that when she does help in this episode, and this is very much worth pointing out, is that she's so proactive with the investigation, she actually gives up new leads that she's not asked for. The second time she meets Reese, she shows up, and effectively she's the one who's completely figured out the adoption, and she's like, up until that point in the episode, no one talks about the guy's kid. At that point, it's just a sympathetic thing to make you like the dad, is that, oh, he cares about his son, he wants to be out and live with his son, and that's make you want to sympathize with him. But Carter's the one who's like, hey, all of these victims, all these potential criminals who are being victimized, they're all single parents. And then that leads to the foster parents and the foster scheme, and she is the one who really spearheads and pursues a lot of that. And I think part of the point there is that she did sniff that out, and it's showing that Fusco obviously is useful and helps because he has to a certain point, but Carter's actually got a very investigative personality, or a skill set, maybe even. And something as simple as her digging for details that the others wouldn't have even looked for, leading to solving a much bigger case, a much more big, widespread case, I think is showing what she adds to the team beyond just having another detective who can look up, criminal databases and shit like that. It's showing her value to the team in a way that, Fusco, while he contributes a lot of things, is very different than that. So I think it's a good episode, but I think it's also a bit more of a normal episode with that extra layer on top that makes it interesting. So I guess what I'm saying is it's a solid 7. Not that I rate these out of 10, but that's where I'm at with this. It's not an amazing episode, but it's doing enough interesting things and moving things forward that I'm, I had a good time with it, and it's left me excited for the next one. So that is a Person of Interest, Season 1, Episode 12. Let me know what you thought of this one in the comments. And of course, like, subscribe, all those things help it a lot on YouTube. It helps more people find the show. And if you really want to support everything as much as you can head over to patreon.com/MailFuzzTV, and funding over there is really the main thing that lets me keep doing this. So thank you very much. I appreciate it. Keep watching TV. Have you got any vanilla?